Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm Davood. I'm here with my friends, John David and Daniel Garner, also known as OG Rose. And we are now in this part discussing chapter 7 of the Tropics of Discourse. This was, I don't know what you gentlemen think, but for me, this was so far my favorite chapter, the favorite essay in this collection. So just a few words before I pass to the next person. Hayden White is kind of discussing aspects of historiography in the 18th century by the history treated by Enlightenment thinkers who emphasized rationality and progress. And the way these thinkers, these 18th century thinkers, treated the concept of irrationality, which they saw as their everything that they stand against. So tyranny, superstition, ignorance, error, all the sources of error and bias. And what is great about this essay is that Hayden White is introducing these historians, these thinkers, and their approach to history as an example to demonstrate the relationship between a person's stance, general stance, their values, what they value, and then what that does to the way they think about history. So in a way, he fleshes out some of the points that he makes in previous essays, but with an example. It's relatively more concrete. All right, John?
Yeah, as Davood was saying, he always opens up a lot of his essays with a putative criticism that one school of historiography is aiming at another school of historiography. And he says here that the historiographers of the 19th century often criticize the what he calls the enlighteners, or the Enlightenment historiographers, mostly writing in the 18th century, for lacking a historical sensibility. And what he means by that is basically not being able to sympathetically or empathetically enter the experience of people who are displaying what they would consider to be irrational behavior. And the interesting thing he points out here is that observation, that criticism, the very fact that criticism exists, sort of begs the question of what a proper or a normative historical sensibility would even be in the first place. And this opens up the entire essay to a few different aspects of 18th century historiographers and the assumptions that they import. He goes into Leibniz's sort of, I guess you could call it his metaphysics, his monadology. He talks about Leibniz thinking that everything is basically of the same kind in the world. Everything is a monad, or made of monads. And that to admit otherwise to admit of different kinds would admit to the fact that things depart from normalcy or normality, which would speak to something being wrong with creation, which would speak to something being wrong with God. So we can rule that out. And then he goes on to talk about Johann Herder and Voltaire and other people. And he essentially comes to the conclusion, I hope I'm not summarizing too much, Daniel. Oh, okay. He essentially comes to the conclusion that these 18th century historiographers are being criticized because they don't appreciate a distinction that Hayden White has brought up over and over again between essentially what is discursive representation in prose, what we think of as fact-based, and the poetic imagination, which is associated with ideas like emplotment and the sort of creative aspect of storytelling. They had a really hard distinction between these two things. And one of the things Giambattista Vico comes along and does in the 18th century is creates a middle way. So instead of discursive representation and poetic imagination, you have this midway of fictive language, which opens up opportunities for consequent historiographers to understand the modes and impulses behind rational behavior that may not have been there for people who had this sort of hard division between those two kinds of languages and their deployment. So he really sees, and we'll see in a later essay, he has an entire essay devoted to Benedette Crocet's criticism of Vico. It's essay number 10 in this book. So he really, really loves Vico. A lot of people who write about sort of historical texts and textual critics tend to be, because Vico was so sort of interesting. But he loves Vico in that way, sees him as really innovative, but also sees some aspects of 18th century historical writing to be quite limited because of the perhaps unconscious assumptions of that dividing line between hard factual discursive language and the creative, the poetic, the figurative, the tropic. The end.
Well, gentlemen, every time y'all open up, I'm like, well, that's why they do the book reviews here, because they do such a good of capturing all the main ideas and bringing it together, and they pronounce all the names correctly as well. So I always appreciate that very much, gentlemen. And I was also quite thrilled. I'm thrilled to hear there's a whole essay on Vico, because I like Vico. Isaiah Berlin got me into the counter enlightenment, all those different thinkers, and I've always enjoyed Harman and so on and so forth. While I was reading this chapter, I couldn't help but, as I was going along, thinking, it's like, how in capitalism we talk, there's the idea of the efficient market hypothesis, that the market is always efficient and makes things good for you. I'm reading this, I'm like, it's almost like there's an efficient history hypothesis, where there's a way in which history is always efficient, what rises to the top, the way that it ends up, it's like he was talking about Herder, it had to end up the way it would have ended up. And then there's this kind of idea that history ultimately is defined by the rational actors, that it is a progress of the rational coming to light. So there's this kind of reading into history in almost efficient historic, it's hard to say, isn't it? Wow. Efficient historical hypothesis that you're going and reading. And this can be, of course, very problematic, because what ends up happening if you have, say, an efficient market hypothesis? Well, then anything that happens is good. If Amazon exists, well, it must be because people want it, right? If big corporate entities are creating whatever they're doing, like there's almost anything the market does necessarily has to confirm the market, because there's a reading into it that it's necessarily efficient. So it always gets the benefit of the doubt. You don't have a good critique necessarily of what the market does. You don't think about it like, why would you regulate it? Because it's going to take care of itself, right? So likewise, you have Herder, this kind of idea that history is going to take care of itself. He's kind of critical of that at the end of it. And he has that great line in the context of Kant, where he says the way one looked at the past of the race conditioned and in the long run actually determined the shape that the future might have. Right. So he's kind of saying that this is really important. I really like it, because it's kind of that Hegelian absolute knowing kind of idea, that the way that people chose to view the past would impact how they went into the future, right? Because kind of the knowledge they had about the past. So if you have this image of history as something that is necessarily efficient, or that it's going to take care of itself, as the Enlightenment would kind of have, because history becomes a narrative of irrationality going away, right? You have less and less rational, it becomes more and more rational, it becomes more and more efficient as you go along. And the point of the Enlightenment historical is to increase the efficiency of that system, right? Likewise, any free market economist, it's the idea of how do we increase the efficiency of the market, just kind of leave it alone, right? The more we can leave it alone, the more it will take care of itself. So likewise, the more we can have history do what it's supposed to do, which of course just happens to be defined by the Enlightenment thinkers and different people like that, the more that it's going to work out. So that's kind of problematic, because if in fact irrationality has a big role in people's lives, or what we now call irrationality, if history is in fact defined by, say, faith in some people's lives, or if emotion has a big role, and if these are all valid ways of knowing, then ultimately, if you view history in a manner that doesn't include those ways of knowing, you have to go into a future of which also excludes those ways of knowing, which could have a negative impact on how people develop, right? Or how humanity develops, if these things in fact had a valid role in the past. So another way to look at it, let's say market regulation had a positive impact on how the market worked. Well, if you read the data and you already have a kind of premise that there's an efficient market hypothesis, that regulation is not needed, then you're going to overlook the role of regulation. You're not going to emphasize it so much. You're not going to play on it, or you're going to kind of underscored or say, okay, well, it may have done some good over there, but that's an exception. It doesn't quite work. So then as you go into the future, you would be on the side of less regulation, right? And maybe less regulation would be good, right? Maybe it would be good, but it doesn't necessarily follow. And the likelihood that you're going to determine rightly what would be the case is going to be much less if you bring to your understanding of how the market works a certain thesis that you're just only going to confirm. So likewise, if you go to the historical account and you have a certain lens that views X, Y, and Z as irrational, that doesn't have a positive impact on how people formulate, then any evidence you have that maybe religious communities, for example, had a positive impact on how the society, well, you're going to say, well, that's an exception to the rule because that doesn't count into what we consider rational. And so then you would go into a future that would have less religion because you're going to assume that that's going to be better. And maybe it would be better, right? Maybe ultimately religion is irrational. But if following like a Berger or some other sociologist or Charles Taylor, I guess, or different people, that religion might have some positive communal roles, or let's at least put it this way, that religion had positive dimensions, that if you get rid of it, you need to think of how to replace it. Well, if you're not even thinking about that, then you might end up in a future that's not so good. So I was reading this and just kind of, it was kind of funny because I was thinking about it's almost like an efficient historical hypothesis, just like the market, like an efficient market hypothesis that then everything has to play into. And then you have the counter enlightenment coming in and try and do some of that correction, which I think Isaiah Berlin's work is so good on. I love Isaiah Berlin on this different thinking. So that was before, to pass it back off to Davood. That was just something I thought about while reading this.
That's a really interesting analogy, the analogy with the market. I need to spend more time on that. Yeah, thank you. I thought maybe we can read a little passage from page 140 because it is important. The way he identifies the weakness and strength of Enlightenment historians, and the way they beg a question about history. I think this thread begins on page 140. So it is the second paragraph here. Quote, "In my view, the causes of the Enlighteners' failures as well as of their successes as historians are not to be found in any inability to understand or even to sympathize with and to tolerate the irrational in history. They lie, rather, in their incapacity to conceive historical knowledge in general as a problem." And the word problem is italicized. So it is not primarily their inability to relate to understand, to sympathize, but it is a more fundamental problem. And that is that they neglect to regard history in terms of being a problem. So history is not a puzzle for them. They treat it too much as a matter of fact. Historical events, yeah, sure, things happen in the past. Telling the truth about the historical events, giving a factually accurate account about the past, yeah, we can do that. Language, similarly, yeah, language is just the tool for us to do those things, to have that kind of veridical or truthful relationship to past events. So here, as I was reading this passage, the question came to my mind: what does it mean to turn something into a problem, or as contemporary people say, to problematize a concept or an issue? Then on 2 pages.
That word was all over my notes.
Yeah. Problem or problematize?
Problematize, yeah.
Great. A couple of
too much academies.
Sure. Basically, what it means to turn something into a problem is to ask what it is that makes something historical. So to make history itself a problem is to ask the question, the very basic question: what is it that makes something historical? What is it that makes a kind of knowledge historical knowledge? So in this way, we can problematize psychology. We can say, what is it that makes a piece of knowledge psychological? So this is a passage from, this is beautiful, from page 146. And the preface is just, it's quite good. One way, I'm quoting, "One way of characterizing the thought of an age is to identify the questions which its representative thinkers consistently beg. One question begged by the Enlightenment was that of the nature of historical knowledge, not the question of what happened in history or the meaning of the historical process, but of how historical knowledge is possible." So of how historical knowledge is possible. This is the fundamental problem of history. So kind of like the problem, the weakness is they skipped some of the basic questions of the discipline. They jumped ahead. And funny enough, he also says that this is the source of their strength. That's why they managed to be so productive, to create a kind of historiography that has the stamp of enlightenment or the rationalist approach to history. So yeah, that was, to me, that was interesting. Something else we could point out maybe later on is how I think my reading of this chapter was that White is arguing how this rationalist approach to history not only excludes some ways of being as irrational, not only judges them and excludes them, but also it produces its own kind of irrational responses. So what we observe in the works of Herder and even Hume are kind of irrational or kind of too far, very implausible responses to the problems of knowledge that are born out of the process of rationalism. Ultimately, they have their roots in rationalism, and it keeps going until it produces its own thing that it started with opposing. Started by opposing irrationalism and ended up creating its own version of irrationality. Anyways, that's enough for me.
I sort of took off on the same idea of history being a problem, or failing to see history as being a problem, and I took a more epistemological turn towards it. Not so much of, I mean, I know he says that 18th century historiographers didn't see historical knowledge as a problem, and I don't mean to second guess Hayden White, but he might also be saying that 18th century historiographers didn't see historical narration and writing as a problem. That seems to be much more clearly what the argument that he's driving at with his examples and his language is saying, not so much as historical knowledge, because he even says they're not arguing about the actual contents and facts of history, but towards the essays and what the last 2/3 of it or so, what he's doing is he's making this distinction that I talked about earlier, the fact that Voltaire and Pierre Bayle, they say that they drew a hard distinction between fabulation and reality. Fabulation, coming from the Latin of story. Our word for fable comes from the same place, and they thought that history was really the writing of everything that was just fact, no fable, nothing figurative, nothing tropological or tropic in it, just the facts, ma'am, sort of history. And that hard distinction is sort of the birthplace, the font of a lot of lack of appreciation for how to write about other people, and the fact that when you write in the first place, I mean, as he's saying, you could just as easily say, go back and read the 5 previous essays. This is what 18th century historiographers didn't appreciate, and then just a backwards U-turn sign. Go back and read this, because he's basically saying that that's the distinction that they didn't appreciate. When Pico comes along and he opens up that sort of via media, that middle way, that middle path that allows subsequent writers of history to understand other cultures who didn't maybe value reason and rationality in the same way as Enlightenment thinkers did. So I saw the problem as being one of failing to appreciate the assumptions that are inherent in the couching of historical narrative, more so than historical knowledge itself. But I realize it's in itself is not a hard distinction. There's a lot of overlap there too.
No, a few things, you mentioned the previous, the other thing I was thinking about is if we have this, as I keep calling, this efficient history hypothesis, then that in of itself is going to move you away from a need to understand history in terms as a literary genre, because novels don't always end at the most rational outcome, right? Novels don't always end, they can end with an irrational outcome. The directionality of a novel is not necessarily efficient, right? It can be dramatic. It can follow a different logic. So I think another kind of overarching point here is if we can combat this idea that there's necessarily should understand history in terms of this rational movement or Enlightenment movement, that too is going to harken back to the cases that he's been making through these entire, through these essays, because novels don't necessarily follow, unless it's a really bad novel where everyone is just doing what's rational and what they think is best and everything works out, blah, blah, I'm Rand or something. Yeah, you heard it. You knew where I was going. Then it would be bad. so, what's good is these different competing ideologies and systems like Brothers Karamazov, right? Where Ivan is an internally consistent system and it's going against Alyosha and so on and so forth. So I think this is part of the case. What's so interesting about Vico is counter to what we tend to think is, Vico looks over at Newton and he's like, this is heresy, right? Science is heresy because you're trying to know the mind of God. So Vico is like, the only things that we can actually know are what man makes. We can't know objective reality. So, science is, in a sense, I don't want to say it was heresy for Vico, but like Vico viewed what Newton was doing as very problematic, because who are we to think that we can understand the mind of God? Which today it's like the exact opposite, right? Where we think that it's the objective scientific things that we can know for certain, and it's the human things that we cannot trust. But for Vico, the only thing we had any possibility of knowing was human-made, right? It had to be something that was human-made. Otherwise, you were trying to understand the nature of the universe, and that was only God could know that. So that in of itself means that Vico's understanding of history must not fall into the realm of science, because if history is being turned into a science, that in of itself is the methodology that he has positioned himself as being against versus Newton. Well, then, of course, if you're going to take this stance where you're like, well, I'm going to do history in a manner that's not like Newton, that's not a scientific history, then you have to ask the question, okay, then how is your science, how is your historical knowledge possible? What are you doing, right? What is your methodology? How does this go about? So by Vico having, I find it just very interesting that by Vico having this position where he views science as problematic, the only things that we can know is what human beings can make, that leads to a asking of these meta questions that we wouldn't even, that we kind of associate with kind of postmodernism and different things like that almost, on trying to say, well, how is historical knowledge possible? What are we doing in historical knowledge? What are we understanding? And I think also in that way, there is something more in Vico. If the only things that humans can understand is what humans make, then everything becomes very contingent. Like what we can do is like the future becomes what we make. It's not something that we're necessarily going to be carried by. It's going to have something to do with our active ingredient in it. And the rest of it is providence almost. The rest of it is God's will. And so we don't really worry about that. So there becomes a much more anthropological, sociological sort of emphasis in Vico that's going to help us understand who we are and what we made and why we made it. And then of course, every time Vico's going about in his work, trying to introduce a scientific explanation, there's a bit of hesitancy because that could be heresy because you're trying to get into God. So you're going to be emphasizing the human element, which of course is what a novel does, right? You don't spend most of a novel of Virginia Woolf talking about the scientific composition of the lighthouse or something like that. You don't talk about the collection of facts that make up Bloomsburg Day or something, with James Joyce. You're going to be talking about the human element. So I think Vico's thinking, it naturally will, of course, incorporate facts because it has to. But Vico is it's almost a necessary evil for Vico. And necessary evil is a little strong, but it's almost this necessary thing you have to do to get at the human element. But he really wants to emphasize that because to emphasize the non-human element is to be playing around with things that God made. And if God made them, who do we think we are to talk about them? So it's just very interesting to me. I think we see Newton's opposition to Newton, Vico's opposition to Newton manifesting in his historiography, is his understanding of history.
Yeah. So to just repeat the structure of that passage from Vico, he said that we humans don't make nature. What we make is our own societies, our own cultural practices. This is what we make. And if we have a chance in understanding something, if we would have a chance, it's our own cultural, social, the way we organize ourselves, that we have a chance at understanding that. We don't have as much of a chance at understanding nature. But what is funny to me now is that we are much closer to a sympathetic position with Newton than to Vico in our time. And the reason why is, I think, because we have that very strong distinction between not just rational and irrational, but also two kinds of people. I think we imagine that there's these scientists and they have direct access to nature somehow. Somehow they have, for them, language is not open to examination and revision. They have this direct access. And then we have the other non-scientists, we have the normal humans who use language maybe more poetically. But what is great about Vico, I think, is that he does away with those distinctions. He says that instead of seeing the rational and irrational as opposite to each other, or scientists and non-scientists, experts, non-experts as opposing forces with each other, we should go back and see what it is that is involved when we describe any situation, when we fabulate, when we make a story, why we describe an event with a surprise, with some kind of emotion, not the other kinds of emotion. And he says that these are not accidental, unnecessary features. When we have an emotion, when we have a metaphorical application of a metaphor, when we are describing something, these are the features of our consciousness. So it is our very consciousness that fabulates, that perceives things as narrative and meaningful, and with the application of metaphors. And so that's the beginning. Vico begins with the character of human consciousness and how these metaphors and narratives, these tropics, they enter into very basic ways in which we make sense. We do poiesis, and we make things out of our experiences. And then out of that, which is not rational or irrational, it is neither rational nor irrational, out of that non-rational, non-reasoned stuff, that material, those processes, emerges something which is still a part of it, emerges something that is now rational. We call that rational. But what is rational depends on that bedrock, which is itself the human consciousness, and neither rational nor irrational. So that's the sense in which, that's why my appreciation of Vico, his greatness, and why he is a counter-enlightenment, which doesn't mean anti-intellectual.
Right.
Yeah, it was making me think about how Vico might have been one of the first modern, maybe one of the first serious thinkers to ever, really, maybe not in so many words, but to say that we wouldn't even have an idea of the rational if it wasn't for these sort of shapes that are and things that our conscious minds do to language, our tendencies for storytelling. The sum total of that is really a large part of what we think of as consciousness. And it's not Vico who says it. White sort of puts the words in Vico's mouth, but he says that if you had to draw a distinction between fable and history, that we wouldn't have history without the fable.
Well, the thing is, like, if I believe that, it's hard for us to imagine it, but if I look at the black clouds out there and I'm like, the gods are angry and that's why they're going to send rain, there's kind of a logic. We think it's stupid because we don't believe in it, but there is a logic. And you see, the word rational has a certain weight to it. We're kind of saying, well, it's not a true logic without saying that, right? That's the problem. These terms get these sort of moral weights to it, right? Like if you think that, eating the Eucharist is going to help you, achieve some sort of sanctification, then it is logical to eat the Eucharist. But someone who's not a Christian just doesn't accept that truth premise, and therefore it is not logic. So, I always like to talk about how truth and rational have a big relation. What you think is rational is relative to what you think is true. But then, of course, how do you determine what is true? If you actually need a truth before you can determine the rational, that would mean that rationality comes after the truth. So by what method did you pick your truth? That's that big dilemma. And that's where he's got that part. And I think Vico and the counter-enlightenment in general was quite good in that. Vico appeared to make reason dependent upon unreason, to make of it a refined form of unreason, the product of which were essentially the same as produced by unreason, 147, where he talks about it. What Vico had a real insight in, and I think you got it exactly right, Davood, is that there's rational, irrational, and non-rational. One of the great fallacies is just having rational and irrational, because that makes everything that's not rational, which of course is a reflection of your truth, irrational, and therefore something that should be brushed aside, shouldn't even be included in the historical account, arguably shouldn't be emphasized in the historical account. Or if it's in the historical account, then it must be overcome. It must be something that you have a kind of overcome, right? Or that you've overcome, or something. If you lose to it, if the nation lose to it, then it's bad, right? But if you have non-rational, and my friend Lorenzo and I, we talk about game theory and how you have to talk about Nash equilibriums, you have to have a category of non-rational, but it's a whole different subject. Historians basically they haven't had a category of non-rational, and that is almost necessarily required a breakdown between irrational and rational, and the rational must necessarily be a reflection of your truth, and that truth is going to be a reflection of your worldview and how you think things are. And so it's not an intentional bracketing out of everything you go against. It's almost the necessary feature of the structuring of thought that you have. It's just a necessary logic that you would say this is irrational, and you would get rid of it. And that was the brilliance of Vico. I mean, I think Vico is just unbelievable. I mean, because the other thing too, like you were saying, Davood, is so for Vico, if he's like, okay, we can never, in a sense, know what a true cup is. It's almost like Kantian Noumenon before that. We can never get to what gravity is or the universe is, but we can get to what is our experience of the universe? What am I making of it? What is my encounter with the universe? And then to focus on that, you end up focusing on the psychology, because even if the mind can never access the universe, because that would require being God, you can access your experience of the universe. So you end up focusing on that. Also for Vico, the reason irrationality plays a role in the historical account is because you can never escape the arena of error in truth, because you can never get to some objective science where you escape all of the problem, right? It has to be a process of the confronting of the error. Error necessarily has to play a role in the historic account, because you can never get out of the realm where error occurs. That would be the objective science where you remove the human element. So then you have to have that play a role, and it has to go, and it has to be forward, and it's very dialectical in a Hegelian sense. Before, I guess when is Vico? 1717 or something like that? I lose track. It's like, he's very, and that's terrible. Maybe it's like 1818. Everyone's like, wow, look at that idiot. You don't know any dates. And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm just a silly boy. But he's really ahead of his time. I really think the Counter Enlightenment was shockingly ahead of its time. Isaiah Berlin's whole thing was that it wasn't studied. I don't think it was, because it wasn't appreciated. I guess it wouldn't be, because it's in Counter Enlightenment, and right there, what does it sound like? It sounds like in praise of irrationality. Counter Enlightenment. It sounds like in praise of irrationality. So that falls into everything we were just saying. You necessarily would bracket it out because it's in praise of irrationality. So then we didn't read Vico. We didn't learn. I guess Haman's another good one in these different things. And I think that's had an impact on us.
I read.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Was it three? Is it called Three Critics of the Enlightenment? Three Critics of the Enlightenment. You're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. And it's 1725. Okay, I'm not crazy for the new science.
Yeah,
all right, I was like, no, it's everything.
everything.
Okay, I doubted myself, and now it's recorded me saying that Vico was in the 1880. Now everyone's going to know that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I thought it was 1712.
That's what always video editor.
Man, we'll fix it. Thank you, Davood. But listen, hey, knowledge advances by error, right? This is what we were saying, right? So no, that's what always blew my mind with Vico. Like, there's something about Vico that reminds me of Hegel. That reminds me, he's like got a sense of the noumenon, but it's from an opposition to Kant, not to Newton, not to Kant. He's like really ahead of his time. I'm really amazed by Vico, frankly. But I do think, to your point, yes, I think it's three thinkers. I think that's it with Isaiah Berlin.
I have it in the other room. I think it's called Three Critics of the Enlightenment, and Haman is one of them. And I remember, and now granted, it's been 20 years since I read that book, but I think he kind of does talk about irrationality a little. Now, that's not all he talks about, certainly, but he does talk about, the kind of emphasis that Enlightenment thinkers have on irrationality, but how people like Haman and Vico and Herder are more sympathetic towards, embracing other kinds of thought too. Mm-hmm. But that was my entree to apparently, at least according to Gore Vidal, Dr. Berlin's name is Isaiah. Isaiah. And if you look at the way it's spelled, that makes perfect sense. But everyone calls him Isaiah, which he says, oh no, it was Isaiah Berlin.
Wow.
But that was my first book ever by him.
I'm going to do that from now on. People don't hear me, they're going to be like, that guy can't pronounce Isaiah. I'll be like, no, sir.
no one says Isaiah. But
be like, that's hilarious.
Obviously, since we're so popular, everyone will be now.
Yeah.
We want to change it.
Yeah. It's really
We're trendsetters. You know?
Yeah, we're trendsetters. Boom. Hashtag Isaiah. We'll have like dashes and it'll be like, ah, Isaiah. It'll be really loud. So people will be like, oh, that's it.
Yeah. I also enjoy Isaiah Berlin's writing. It's much easier than his speech because he's a little bit fast when he speaks. What did I want to say? Counter-enlightenment. Oh, yeah. You said that counter-enlightenment sounds like it's going against the current. And going against the current, there's another way to read that counter-enlightenment, and that is like music counterpoint. And counterpoint doesn't really go against the main line of melody,
but plays with it.
Plays with it, and complements it.
Yeah.
So that's the way we can think about counter-enlightenment, as the counterpoints to enlightenment. And it keeps recurring. It keeps coming out again, showing itself, showing its a tendency. Like I think entry into counter-enlightenment thinking was with Husserl's book, much later than his Vico. But Husserl has, I think it was his last book, if I'm not wrong, The Crisis of European Sciences, and in which he critiques the basic foundations of the natural sciences, the natural attitude, and how natural attitude rests on a foundation, how science rests on a non-scientific foundation, how rationality, objectivity rests on a foundation that is itself subjective or intersubjective. But it's really good to go back.
A fascinating little essay.
Yeah, it's nice to go back and see, these things keep happening, these responses to the tendency to be rational and hyper-rational, and think that we can solve the problems once and for all.
Well, and the thing is, if you don't do this middle way with people, it's almost like what they understood is if you don't kind of follow with the counter-enlightenment as going with it, they understood eventually people would find out on their own that like the Enlightenment couldn't do it. And then there would be like a reaction against it that would be really bad. Like there would be a really hard crisis. Like you see today, nobody trusts anything. Nobody knows how to think. Nobody believes the authority. It's all like a mess. Every historical account is a lie. Like that's where it's so funny. Like in a very real way, even though people accuse Hayden White of like destroying history by relativizing it, no, he's actually like trying to save it by making it a literary genre. He's like, if you do not do this, people will find out it is not a science, and then they will throw all of history out, and then we're in real trouble. So we need to find this kind of middle ground, because as long as you accept the premise that we've said 100 times that literature can be a vehicle of truth, then what he's doing is not a problem. In fact, it's brilliant, because it's a way to find a middle ground between saying that history is a source of real knowledge, but it is also subjectively influenced. That does not mean that it is therefore relativized. So he's trying to save it. So like with Vico and these people, they're like, what they're trying to do is they're like, okay, we're going to put the emphasis though on the human element, because the human element is what shapes things. And the facticity, we're going to, of course, have to include that to some degree, but we're not going to delude ourselves into thinking that we can transcend the human arena by making a science of history, because the moment we do that and it inevitably fails, then people are going to overreact and throw the baby out with the bathwater, and then we're not going to have any. Then we're in trouble, because if indeed the future is in some respects created by your relation to history, and now you view history as just kind of foregone or it's no good, well then your future is no good. Like if you deconstruct history as being lost, then also you actually, if we follow the logic, deconstruct the future as well. You don't have a very good future. So you have to find that middle ground. But of course, to me, the very fact that we accuse Hayden White of being a hard relativist means we're still operating within the dichotomy of rational or irrational. What Hayden White is doing is non-rational. What Hayden White is doing, he's operating according to this third kind, noting that you have to do that you have to think in non-rational terms. The choice of your framework by which you understand history is a non-rational choice, because it will determine the arena in which rationality and irrationality are constituted. So we have to think about what is the best non-rational choice for how we're going to think about history. Because if we don't own that, if we only think about like approaching history in terms of rational or irrational, well, then the scientific approach is going to win every day of the week. You're always going to have a scientific approach because it necessarily sets the board where it's the most rational things to do. But that is impossible, as Hayden White has been stressing. So the whole enterprise falls apart. So again, it's just very interesting to me that this tendency to think what Vico is doing is irrational, or what Hayden White is doing is relativizing. All of that is speaking to that we're still operating within, there's only two options, rational or irrational. And it just that mistake where you don't introduce the category of non-rational, if you don't introduce that, it permeates the whole structure. Like the damage that does pollutes you from top to bottom, and it corrupts the whole system top to bottom. It corrupts you in the operations of how you do history, and then how you even think about the frameworks of history. And it's just, to me, the very tendency to discard Vico or to discard Hayden White means we're still operating in a behind the times dichotomy of it's either rational or irrational, and we need to move beyond it. It's the same, right? It's either like relativistic or it's objective, right? It's the same thing. It's an either or, and that really sets us up to not appreciate what we need to appreciate to get a true historical account, and then of course to have an operating society. It's the same thing. Like, how do you operate in pluralism if you don't have the category of non-rational? Like the givens that people choose to operate their life according to tends to be a non-rational choice, of which then organizes what is irrational and rational to them. If they say a Hindu or a Christian or an atheist or a Republican or conservative, like, why did they choose to be a conservative instead of a liberal? Because they accepted some axioms, probably because their grandparents and their mother was, and it's a non-rational choice. They just absorbed it, and that then organizes what's rational and what's irrational. So you don't even have a category. Without non-rational, you basically can't understand humans. Like, without the category of non-rational, you really don't have a way to understand humans. And then, of course, you can't understand any science or field that involves the human element, such as history. So the category of non-rational is just absolutely quintessential.
Mm-hmm. Non-rational, we could also divide that further, but that's a bit of a detail. We can say we have pre-rational, which is like rationality is not yet self-aware, and then we can have meta-rational, which is what Hayden White and others are trying to do. I wanted to ask you this question about the final 2 pages of the essay. What do you think about this idea of progress? How Hayden White is inviting us to think about, because I don't think he wants us to drop ideas like progress and improvement, but the way in which he wants us to keep this idea is different. It is not, when we think about progress, it is not because we are looking at history, looking at the past and seeing a trend, and then we just say, oh yeah, it is a matter of fact that we have been improving and then we will continue. The way he wants us to have a relationship with progress is based on a moral principle. And I'm not sure if this is his position or he's a position that he's attributing to Kant and other people. So what do you think? John, maybe you can go. So the place of progress, does it have a place in White's scheme?
I sort of found myself wondering what he would have thought about, one of Steven Pinker's recent books called The Better Angels of Our Nature, wherein Pinker basically argues that he kind of supports a Whiggish view of history that says, we are getting better even over long stretches of time. I've not read the book, but I don't know if he thinks that that's a necessary thing. I think things like 2 world wars in 1 generation kind of, might make you think about the continuous progress that humanity has made. And so I would certainly prefer to live in the 21st century more than I would, prefer to live in the 10th or the 15th or even the 19th. But it seems like there is an occasional slip backwards every once in a while that just kind of makes you think and attest to the fact that we need to understand the role of irrationality, because many humans are indeed irrational. And that's how a lot of wars get started. And those wars need to be written about, and that's history. And that's an argument that, sort of eats its own tail. But yeah, I was sort of curious about how Enlightenment thinkers and 19th century ones too would think about that whole Steven Pinker argument. I don't know if either one of you have read it, but.
Well, Pinker really wants to stress that, yes, ever since those World War IIs, you've had this kind of great peace. You've had these smaller wars, but he wants to go through, there hasn't been any major war, there's been territorial. And he's kind of writing that book also kind of in response to people saying, look at all the terrorism, look at all the irrational, things are getting worse. He says, well, if you look at a numbers chart, it's not so bad. And the other thing he really wants to stress is, like, he says, like, in the medieval ages, a way people had entertainment was burning cats, right? They would burn cats. And he's like, do you even does that idea even cross your head? Like, does it even cross the average person's head that we can be entertained by burning cats? And you're like, well, of course it doesn't. And that's kind of really what he wants to focus on, that there are some ideas that just we don't even think about because we've been so subconsciously cultivated to think that we shouldn't do it. Like, for example, we have big debates about waterboarding with torture, right? You know, that it's a terrible thing. In the past, we got, I guess, what is it, side or whatever, like all the tortures, the horrible torture, like the handbook of torture they do. The waterboarding, they wouldn't even blink. They'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, we're going to like take some horses and tie people up and pull them. I mean, those are the things you would think about doing. And then, of course, we can get into Foucault and different things. But basically, you know, Pinker wants to say there are certain ideas now that if you go through history, they don't even cross our mind anymore, right? Like we don't even do it. And to him, there's like a moral evolution that's occurring, where even if you have these big violent wars, there's even the way that those wars are carried out can entail a very different kind of moral orientation that he wants to argue. What are we saying, John?
We may not bury cats, but we have people today who have normal 9-to-5 jobs who think that it's perfectly okay to go find a homeless person and attack them and set them on fire.
Well, and you see, this comes to like Nassim Taleb's criticism of the book. You know, one of the things Nassim Taleb wants to say is like, all right, Mr. Pinker, the reason we hadn't had like these giant world wars is, you know, one is because if another war happens, it's going to be so bad that we're all going to die. Is that really a moral evolution? Is deterrence really a moral evolution? And the other thing he says, okay, we don't burn cats, but there's lots of people who are doing stuff that you don't pay attention to, like beating up homeless people or different things like that. So, you know, Taleb has a really good critique of the book. And there is, you know, Pinker, Dr.
I'll take
Pinker,
that as a compliment.
Yeah. And, you know, I obviously love Nassim Taleb, and I have to kind of agree with him in some respects, although I don't deny that we do need to be careful. You know, one of the things Pinker, and he is an Enlightenment thinker. He's trying to save the Enlightenment. He thinks we've lost the Enlightenment. He wants to bring it back. He thinks our problem is we don't have enough Enlightenment. And there's arguably, it depends on what you mean by that, right? Yeah, sure. It just depends on what you mean by that. I mean, again, if we take the counter-Enlightenment seriously, what the counter-Enlightenment is not saying, the counter-Enlightenment of Vico is saying, people like that are saying the Enlightenment is, it's not that it's wrong, it's that it's incomplete. And it's incomplete to such a degree that if it goes about as if it's complete, it will give rise to some massive problems. So it's more like you need the both. And then, of course, Hegel, right? The dialectic and blah, blah, blah. And I'll avoid that topic. But for, I think Taleb's critique of Pinker is quite good. The idea that history, the problem is too, when you ask, does history progress? The first question is, by what metric? You know, by what metric does it progress? And then, of course, who defines what is history? Because then if you say, well, it progresses by X metric, well, who decides what's history? What is history? Is that just the sum total of the collective consciousness of the human race? You know, what is exactly constituted by history? What is the human element, right? And, you know, and I think the first thing we have to recognize is that we tend to think that history is getting better because we have better technology. Right? We have better technology. We look around and we say, well, we must be smarter because now we have laptops. And in the past, they didn't have laptops. Today we do. Therefore, history has progressed. That sounds good, but once you understand that technology tends to be a result of trial and error, it tends to be a result of screwing up, not of getting smarter, then technology, of course, gets better with time because you have had more time to screw up. You know, you've had more mistakes and more time.
Technology, I think, is totally value neutral. And
that's exactly
Heidegger
right.
said this too. As technology progresses, that says nothing about our ability to make choices with it or make, you know, increase human welfare with it or anything else like that.
Yeah, it's a terrible mistake. I mean, Neil Postman always says it's kind of a Faustian bargain, right? For everything you gain from technology, you lose something else, right? And, you know, is it really progress if it's just moving the chess pieces around, right? It just depends. It's progress. You no longer have to walk. You no longer have to go to the bathroom outside because you can bring it inside, but you also are now dealing with obesity because you don't have as much, you know, it's always a plus and minus, right? And I think that's a sophisticated view of technology. So if we take out technology as a valid indication that history is progressing, is it because, are we smarter, right? Are people smarter today? You know, maybe that's a sign that history progressed. Well, what is your definition of smarter, right? You know, maybe people have if I can pull out a phone and look up any fact in the world, am I smarter? Or am I only smarter if I'm able to improvise without looking at my phone, right? You know, what constitutes smart, right? You know, you get all these different questions. I think for Hayden White, because I could go on and on about all these examples, I think what Hayden White wants to do is he really wants to say, if we think history progresses, then it won't, because we'll let it take care of itself. What he wants to do is say, no, history progresses. It doesn't necessarily get better. He doesn't want to say it necessarily gets worse. And he doesn't want to necessarily say that 10 years from now is better than 10 years in the past. You know, maybe you go up and then you go down and then you go up a lot and then you go down. It could be all sorts of different movements. But I definitely think it's the case, and I agree with this, that the more we think of history deterministically, the less likely that we're going to do what we need to do today to improve ourselves and to take things seriously, to make it better. Like, let's take, for example, nuclear war. Like, if you just kind of believe that nuclear war will never happen, that is not anything that could ever occur because we're smart and we would never do that, well, you may not do the things you need to do today to make sure that nuclear winter doesn't come, because you're just going to assume that it will. So likewise, if you say, oh, well, we're getting smarter, well, then you may not read books and you may not spend your free time a certain way because you're going to just assume that it's going to occur. And this is where I do like that thing that I said at the beginning, where our idea of the past affects the future. So likewise, our ideas of how the future is going to manifest, if it's necessarily going to be better or worse, will impact what we do today. And that is where I do prefer, in that talk with Dr. Last on Hegel's absolute, where what constitutes the absolute is relative to the subject's experience of the absolute and what they take it, and they're always moving. So likewise, the future is something that we do. It doesn't take care of itself. And in fact, I guess we could put it this way: the more and more we think the future takes care of itself, the less likely we're going to like the way that it takes care of itself. The more and more we're aware that we need to do something, then the better the chance that it's going to be. Of course,
our assumptions make us lazy, and our laziness collapses the possibilities for the future.
Yeah, it's like a giant joke. It's like, if you believe the future is better, then it's not. But if you believe the future won't necessarily be better, then there's a higher chance it will be better. Like, it's this kind of ironic move, which, again, if literature is a valid category in your thinking, that happens in literature all the time. Doesn't really happen in science, though. Science, it's kind of like, well, as long as we discover and figure out the truth of how things operate, well, then things will get better. I guess that's kind of the mistake, right? Like, if you have if you think, maybe the other mistake is you think science is why the world progresses. Science seems to necessarily get better with the future. So the more into the future we go, the more we'll understand how things really operate. And the more we understand how things really operate, the better things will get. That seems to be kind of a logic that's going. But of course, there's a lot more to human civilization than just the scientific element. There's the political element. There's the social element. And even if it's true, it could be true. This is, I guess, I've always thought that maybe in some areas, like science and fact garnering, like gathering more facts and collecting facts and testing, there may be areas of civilization that inherently get better with time. They just naturally, you get newer technology. I almost want to, that's the word. I almost want to say there are some things where you almost have to get newer things with time, newer technologies, but I don't know if they're better. That's the key word. Like, does history always create new things? And that's, well, it's like, duh, Daniel, of course it does. There's more time. But I actually think that's an important distinction, because you do need to separate the new from the better. That's a conflation people tend to do. If it's new, it's better. Well, maybe not. Maybe the future will be new, but it will not necessarily better. And it will not necessarily be better. And then when you put it that way, it becomes really kind of trite. It's like, well, yeah, the future's new. It's different from today. That's the whole idea. But it's like, but that's it. That's all it is. It's new. It's not necessarily better. If the new is going to be better, then what are you doing?
To say the future will be new is a big old DVD, which doesn't really take us anywhere. So
yeah, exactly. And it takes all the romanticism out of it, but actually that's what we want. We want to take the romanticism out of it so that we take ownership, that we do something about it. It's like, also too, it's like Hayden White wants to take the romanticism out of history by calling it the science of history, right? It's almost like he wants to remove that idealism so that it's like more real and we do a better job at our history. So likewise, we want to take this romanticism out of saying the future will be better and simply just say the future will be new, which is basically a truism. So then it's like, okay, well, we'll have to determine if it's going to be better.
All right. Hopefully there's like one or two viewers still with us.
Those people are talking. We went from Vico, the counter-enlightenment, to the future is new. What does that even, what?
I like that. I think that word that you use, Daniel, ownership, I think that's key. Ownership about what judgments we have. That we make a judgment about progress. We make it kind of like a pragmatist decision about progress because we want to meet with hope with the future progress halfway. We want to meet progress halfway, and maybe things will happen. We will get lucky too. But it's not this deterministic historical determinism that we are relying on. Just rest and things will take care of themselves. All right. Any final words, final thoughts? This was, believe it or not, this was for viewers who might be interested in the length of this essay was not, it wasn't that long. It was, I think, 15 pages.
This is one of the shortest ones, actually.
Yeah. Short and
Next
enjoyable.
week, we have one that's, I think, 25 or 30
challenging.
pages.
Yeah, I think 30 pages.
Oh my gosh, 25. What can I do?
I'm gonna start
my
tonight.
cousin was into that, like, Vico is awesome, everyone. Vico is great. The Counter Enlightenment, go learn about the Counter Enlightenment. It's pretty great.
Yeah, it makes me want to read La Scienza Nuova together.
Oh, dude, I could do a Counter Enlightenment thing. Yeah.
Which one? Which book did you mention, John?
The New Science.
The New Science. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking, if we read the New Science with this pace, just imagine.
Oh, it's a chunky book. I mean,
Yeah.
it would keep us busy for 6 months.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard. And there's not a lot of work on Vico. I mean, you kind of think there is, but there really is not. I don't feel like there is. And it's important in my view.
There are some relatively obscure scholars working on Vico.
Yeah, obscure.
Yeah, good on them. All right. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you, John. Thank you, Daniel.
Bye.
And yeah, for viewers also.